Good evening. My name is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs here at Village Preservation. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this presentation of the original Chelsea Piers, New York's Maritime Grand Central Terminal, presented by moi. But now, before we dive into this evening's presentation, if this is the first time you are joining us for a village preservation program, I just want to tell you a little bit about village preservation. We were founded back in 1980, and we work to document, preserve, and celebrate the special architectural and cultural and historic heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've helped secure landmark designation of more than 1,300 buildings in our neighborhoods, and we host about 80 free programs like this throughout the year. We do everything from in-person walking tours, webinars, of course, exhibition tours, lectures, and book talks. Nearly all of our programs are free. Now, we are a members-based organization, so your support is absolutely critical to the work that we do. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment, scan that QR code there you see on your screen and consider becoming a member or just heading over to villagepreservation.org and learning a little bit more about the advocacy work that we do, all the other great programs that we have going on. We just released our August programming calendar. And I also highly recommend, whether you decide to become a member or not at this time, to definitely check out the free resources that we have available on our website. We have a ton of awesome virtual maps. We have maps from the history of the Fifth Avenue, which just celebrated 200 years at the end of last year. And we just released a new map on Art Deco architecture within our neighborhoods as Art Deco celebrated its centennial this past spring. Now, speaking of Art Deco, we have a program coming up in 1 week about Art Deco, the Art Deco Centennial, a guide to the Jazz Age style in our neighborhood, city, and world. It will also be a Zoom program, so you can enjoy it from the comfort of your own home, also at 6 p.m. So definitely head over to villagepreservation.org and learn a little bit more about what we do and all our other great programs. Now, before we really dive into this evening's programming about Chelsea Piers, some of you might be wondering, Chelsea Piers? You mean that big, giant sports center along the Hudson? Well, what's so special about that? Okay, there's an ice rink and sports center there, but big deal. Well, I'm going to tell you it's a very exciting history. I'm doing this presentation this evening because I absolutely love maritime history. I am a big maritime history buff. I was one of those kids that nerded out on the Titanic, loved learning about all the great ships that were crossing the Atlantic, but there was kind of a piece of the story that was missing. What did they do when they got to their destination, which was generally here in New York City for the first half of the 20th century? So that is how I really learned to discover a lot more about what the original Chelsea Piers is. Now, this is what Chelsea Piers is today. As I mentioned, it's this sports facility built back in 1995. Now, for some of the longtime New Yorkers, when you think of the waterfront, today it's that beautiful Hudson River Park waterfront where you can go jogging and those little park areas, really, really nice. Probably for a lot of folks living here since the 60s and 70s, this is what they remember for the waterfront. So they don't really remember a lot of extraordinary things probably happening there. And there was a different type of cruising happening during the 70s and 80s on those piers at that time. Now, these two pictures here from the 70s and 80s are from Village Preservation's image archive, so you can also check that out on villagepreservation.org as well. And just before I forget, if you do have questions, you can go ahead and pop those questions into the chat or the Q&A feature, and I'll try to answer as many of those questions at the end of this presentation. But now, what was the original Chelsea Piers? Well, we're going to have to first put it into a little context. Why was it going to be built? Why was it so important to New York City? But really, why was New York City so important? Why did it need to have this built? So this drawing here is from the late 19th century. New York City really wasn't all that special just 100 years ago. If you've seen the musical Hamilton, they sing "greatest city in the world" is one of the lines in one of the songs in the musical. It really wasn't particularly at that point during the Revolution. But at the turn of the 19th century, New York underwent an extraordinary period of growth. And that was really thanks to it being a great maritime city and a city that would continually invest in new innovation, technological way of doing business, and infrastructure. But it went up and down, up and down. There were periods where New York's waterfront was already going through a period of decline, only for it to go through another monumental rise. Now, one of the extraordinary things to know about the island of Manhattan is it's about 30% bigger today than what it was when the Dutch discovered Manhattan. And that is in part because New York has always been about real estate. And one of the first ways we were building wasn't up, but out into the river. In this drawing here towards the bottom, excuse me, towards the bottom here, you can see the East River. That's really where New York's waterfront and maritime history got its start. But then we can take a look towards the left side of the image, all of those piers and sailing ships rising up along the Hudson waterfront. Now, one of the ways that New York City government was making money was it was selling these things called water lots. It was actually selling unmade land. So what happened was is merchants would purchase these so-called water lots, and then it would be up to them to fill out those water lots. They would fill it with rubbish, sink a ship, whatever. But what it allowed them to do was to expand out into the deeper portions of the East River and the Hudson River, which made it much easier for docking, and you could expand docking facilities. But this kind of created an issue by the middle of the 19th century. New York was starting to become a victim of its own success. Now, New York has one of the world's greatest natural harbors. And through the first half of the 19th century, New York developed new ways of shipping. It developed one of the first ocean liners or packet ships. And these were ships that sailed on a specified schedule, whether the ship's hold was filled with cargo or not, and no matter the weather. The first one set sail in 1818, and this was heading to Liverpool. Now, these were designated routes, and these ships would leave on a schedule. Seems very basic to us today, but it was absolutely revolutionary for the time. 1825, one of the greatest pieces of infrastructure is completed, the Erie Canal. So now we have New York connected to the American hinterland, the Midwest. All the grain and produce coming from the Midwest is now being processed through New York. The ocean liners help it dominate the North Atlantic. The city also is connected to New England with a series of ferries. And then there's all the ferries connecting all the different boroughs. And the city is connected to the southern United States through dominating the shipping and carrying the cotton. So New York was intimately linked with the slave economy of the South. Now, this made New York incredibly prosperous and rich and the focus for international shipping for the United States. Between 1830 and 1860, the number of ships calling in the port of New York each year doubled. The population was doubling about every 20 years in the city. But there was a problem. The waterfront was really a hodgepodge of different piers and docks and wharves because they had all been built by the folks that had bought the water lots. Many of them were not particularly well maintained. And some of the shipping companies were becoming upset because they wanted better facilities to be docking at. So the city thought, oh, let's continue moving uptown. But at this point, you had the Washington market, the Gansevoort market, and most of those were within Greenwich Village and downtown New York. These would be the markets carrying the fresh produce that would help stock the ships for their long voyages wherever they may be going in the world. So most of the shipping companies wanted to remain below 14th Street, if at all possible, for docking. Now, this created an absolutely crowded condition, but New York kept expanding out into the Hudson River, especially as ships became bigger and bigger. They could no longer necessarily dock in the East River. Now, by 1837, the city had designated what was called 13th Avenue. Not sure how many of you know that New York City at one point did have a 13th Avenue. This was built up from 1837, a whole other city block going from West Street out to the waterfront at 13th Avenue. Now, by the end of the 19th century, though, Congress passed a law and it basically took away control of the waterfront, development of the waterfront from the city to the US Army Corps of Engineers was given control of the waterways. The city had tried to bring order to the waterfront in 1870 when it started to integrate a lot of its waterfront authorities into the Department of Docks and Ferries in 1870. Now, the Department of Docks had grand ambitions for the New York City waterfront because, as I said, but by the mid-19th century, the waterfront was starting to struggle, and New York was absolutely terrified of losing its place as the preeminent city for, as the preeminent maritime city for the United States. But now they needed permission from the US Army Corps of Engineers in order to expand once again out into the Hudson. Well, when they originally asked, they wanted to undergo a massive development of the Greenwich Village waterfront. The US Army Corps of Engineers said no. You are not allowed to expand any more out into the Hudson River. So what were they going to do? So now I've circled this part of the map in blue here. This is a good chunk of the Greenwich Village waterfront because we're now going to go to another map that's just going to be oriented in a different direction. Here we have an east-west map, but now we're going to take a look at the same piece of land here, highlighted in blue. It is just a north-south oriented map. Now, the new piers that they decided to build would not be going out into the river. Instead, they came up with a rather ingenious plan to actually bring the river once again more inland and take apart many of those water lots that they had granted over the last century and a half. So development started here in the Greenwich Village waterfront. They wanted to build these gorgeous new pier facilities for all these great new ocean liners that the shipping companies were developing. They brought in the waterfront by about 250 feet inland. This was a massive undertaking. They had to use eminent domain. They kicked businesses and residents off of the about a 6-block area. They had to buy businesses out, buy people out as well. Sometimes they even started demolishing buildings before things were even settled in court, because plenty of people went to court to try to preserve their property. But development went on apace. Then about the mid-1890s, they had developed a brand new, gorgeous Greenwich Village waterfront. The only issue was, by the time that they had finished developing the waterfront, it was already kind of out of date, because ocean liners were now growing at such an exponential rate. The size of ocean liners tripled between 1900 and 1914. This was an extraordinary rate of growth. So once again here, end of 19th century, New York City is paranoid. Are we going to lose our place as top dog maritime city of the US? Do we really want to lose it to Boston or Philadelphia? There was even a slightly kooky plan to build a giant shipping facility out in Montauk on Long Island, and then bring trains that people would take the train into the city from there. Or they thought of further developing the waterfront in New Jersey. But most people sailing, especially the upper classes, really preferred to land right in Manhattan. So once again, the Department of Docks decided to get to work, that they would build yet another great modern shipping facility. But before I go on, I just want to share a couple of images here. So this is Pier 51. So this is a little bit south of where the Chelsea Piers that we're going to be talking about in just a minute would be built. These were these new pier facilities built at the end of the 19th century, brand new, gorgeous facilities, really trying to clean up the waterfront, because the city was described as, on the inside, it was a palace, and on its edges, it was a hovel, because the waterfront was pretty messy, was riddled with crime, but it was absolutely critical to the city's self-image and to its economy. And this is the period of the City Beautiful movement. So there was really this urge to want to completely redevelop the waterfront, both for economic dominance, to maintain that dominance, but also to really make folks feel like they were having a grand entrance into the city of New York. So here is a couple of other images here of the waterfront. And we're going to be speaking about the ship, the great ocean liner we see at the bottom, a little bit later, because this was one of the reasons that really precipitated the development of what became the original Chelsea Piers. This was going to be one of the largest infrastructure development projects in New York City history at the time. And it was because of ships like this. On the left, we have the Lusitania, Mauritania. You can see it matched up against the Singer building. On the right, we have the German ocean liner Imperator matched up against the Woolworth building. And these ships were growing bigger and bigger and bigger. So this grand development they had done for the Greenwich Village waterfront had already become too small for ships of this caliber. And this was the type of folks that these ships were carrying. This is the first class dining saloon of the Lusitania, and the first class passengers wanted to sail on a ship that looked like a hotel, and they wanted to make a grand entrance into New York. Now, the Lusitania was a little over 700 feet long. The Lusitania was owned by the Cunard Company, which was considered for most of the 19th century the greatest shipping company on the North Atlantic. Was based in Britain, but Cunard also had a great rival, the White Star Line. And by 1910, 1911, they are now building the two world's largest ocean liners, the Olympic and what would be the Titanic. And New York City was not ready to accept them at that point when these ships were being built, because they were now nearly 900 feet long. And here we have the Titanic. So it was decided they were once again going to build a great port facility to accept the Olympic and Titanic and the other great liners being built by the shipping companies in Europe. So it was decided to move a little bit further up from the Greenwich Village waterfront, starting at Little 12th Street and going up to 23rd Street. Once again, the Department of Docks went to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, said, can we please extend the land out into the Hudson River to build larger piers to help accept these ships? And once again, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said no. But the Department of Docks persisted and now undertook one of the largest building projects in the city's history. The rest of 13th Avenue would be removed. There would be a move inland, not by 250 feet, but by nearly 600 feet, they would move in, because they wanted to build piers that could now accept these ships of these incredible size. But they also wanted these facilities to be grand and magnificent. This is now the same time period that Grand Central Terminal is being built, Pennsylvania Station is being built, the great skyscrapers are rising in Lower Manhattan. Why should the greatest maritime city in the country, the greatest city in the country at this time, and well on its way to becoming the busiest port in the world, it should have a port facility to welcome the greatest ocean liners to the greatest city and do justice to New York. So Whitney Warren of Warren and Wetmore was picked to design this new facility that would become known as Chelsea Piers. They would be the very firm that would design and build Grand Central Terminal, which would open in 1913. So construction of the Chelsea Piers got underway by 1895, where they had to break down the old waterline bulkhead, excavate all of that land, once again, buy up tons and tons of property, use eminent domain, kick businesses and people out, and move further inland into the city. All in all, it would be a project costing well over $25 million at that time. Depending on what kind of historic inflation calculator you use, that would be well over $6 billion, if not more, in today's money. So this was a massive, massive undertaking. So now we'll take a look at some of the images here of construction. This was going to be a massive undertaking. They drilled those pylons into the riverbed, then put a block of concrete over it, and then the shed houses that would stick out into the river were built with a steel frame. They would have partly glass ceiling on the top level to allow as much natural light in as possible. But the front, what would face out onto West Street, would be clad in pink granite and decorated with beautiful, beautiful motifs up front. And this is what we got by the grand opening of the Chelsea Pier facility in February of 1910. It was now considered the most advanced docking facility in the entire world at this point. And we'll talk a little bit more about all the different gizmos and gadgets they had with inside to accept all these passengers. But Chelsea Piers was a complex of 9 piers, as I mentioned, stretching from Little 12th Street up to about 23rd Street. And the shipping lines that would be using the facilities were the American line, the Red Star line, the White Star line, the Phoenix line, the Atlantic Transport line, the French line, and Cunard. And Pier 54 was one of the 3 docking piers used by the Cunard line. And it truly was a glorious, beautiful facility, a real Grand Central on the Hudson, capable now of accepting thousands and thousands of passengers, because it isn't just the first class passengers coming to New York, it is also now the millions of immigrants flooding into the country from across the Atlantic as well. Now here, these little sheds, pardon me, these little sheds would be the passenger entrances into the facility. Then in the middle here, where we have that archway, that's where deliveries of baggage and supplies could be made to the lower level, preparing a ship for its voyage or taking the luggage and such off the ship after it arrived. And you can see it absolutely dominated this part of the West Side here. An absolutely magnificent structure. And I just wanted to come here because I did mention some of the decorations. I was able to track down an old article in like the Builders and Architect magazine from the period that brought on some highlights about the pediments and these beautiful statuary and motifs at the front of the building. So you had the goddess Aphrodite as the keystone over the archway. Over each of those passenger entrances, we had the Mercury keystone. And we all know that Mercury's Hermes, the great statue, crowns Grand Central Terminal. And then on the corner of each, this was this decoration of land and commerce. So beautiful, beautiful decoration. Now, one of the interesting things is it is actually pretty tough to find some images of what were the facilities on the inside. What did it look like on the inside? How did it work on the inside? So this is one of the passenger waiting rooms, these beautiful arched ceilings, vaulted arched ceilings. This would be facing towards the street. On the left, you can see a little bit of the window there, that arched window. These would be clad in marble, but there were actually multiple passenger waiting facilities. And here's another one. This is from the French line's waiting room on their pier, Pier 57. Of course, the French putting a little pizzazz to their waiting room. So very much kind of like a fancy, fancy lounge that we find at an airport today. But as I said, there were multiple waiting rooms. These waiting rooms were designed for first and second class passengers because I mentioned there was third class as well. Third class would have their waiting rooms on the lower level. And in one article from the time, it described a really interesting different set of how the waiting rooms were designed. The first and second class waiting rooms were designed with marble or wood paneled floors and walls and facilities to relax. The third class waiting rooms on the lower levels had rubber floors, which they said was for easy cleaning. So you can kind of insinuate from what people were thought of the immigrants coming in at that time. Now, within the pier facility, you had all sorts of machinery, elevators to take passengers up to the second levels, conveyor belts for luggage, and much of it was all now electric. They had their own power generation in these facilities as well. There was also space for a watchman's office, the customs house office, and we're going to get to the customs house in a little bit. There were two money exchange offices as well, one for the third class passengers on the lower level, and one for the first and second class passengers on the upper level. And here is what the top level of the pier looked like. It's very reminiscent in some ways of actually a train station in some ways, but you can see those letters all helping to organize passengers and baggage. Now, the third class passengers would board here on the facilities on the ship as well, but they would also disembark at Chelsea Piers. And I bet a number of you are asking, but wait a minute, this isn't even near Ellis Island. Didn't they depart on Ellis Island first and get processed there? Actually, no, none of the ocean liners docked at Ellis Island. They would always dock here generally in Manhattan, especially these big giant ocean liners coming from Europe would dock in Manhattan. And all the passengers would disembark on the pier. Generally, first and second class passengers were let off first and their baggage. And then the third class passengers, and remember, I said they would be allowed to disembark on the lower level. They were kept completely separate from first and second class passengers. Now, first and second class passengers would have to undergo an inspection, and we're going to talk a little bit about the customs inspection that they had to undergo before they could leave and then go right into New York City. Third class passengers in general could not. You had to go through like an immigration services, and there were sometimes a very small handful of American citizen third class passengers. They would be allowed to disembark and then leave the pier facility from there. But the vast majority of third class were immigrants. So they would disembark at Chelsea Piers, but then from the pier, they would have to take a ferry that would take them to Ellis Island and then go through the whole inspection process there. And then they would generally take another ferry from Ellis Island, either taking them to one of the ferry stops in Manhattan if they were planning to stay in New York, or they could go to one of the many train-run ferry stops along the New Jersey coast if they were going to be going onward further west into the United States. But they would not be allowed to enter New York City from Chelsea Piers. That was only first and second class passengers. An interesting note is that immigrant first and second class passengers did not have to go through Ellis Island. They could disembark at Chelsea Piers and then enter the city as an American citizen would be allowed. So first and second class did not have to go through Ellis Island. Now, this is a really, really interesting picture because this is the site that should have been seen on in April 1912 when Titanic should have completed its voyage to New York City. It would have docked at Chelsea Piers. But this is about a year earlier. This is Titanic's slightly older sister, Olympic, here docking in 1911. So if you can just see in the top left corner here, you see this gentleman with the boater hat, these folks exciting to see the great Olympic completing its maiden voyage to New York City. And just to kind of help put the rivalry between the shipping companies into perspective, as Olympic was coming in to dock, Lusitania was docked just a little further down. She was slightly older than the Olympic, but Olympic was now fresh, new, and bigger than the Lusitania. The Lusitania, instead of cheering Olympic's triumphant entrance into New York Harbor, kind of snubbed her a little bit. It didn't blow its horn or ring its bell for the ship as it passed. It just let Olympic pass, and then she kind of went out of New York Harbor with her tail between her legs because she was now no longer the largest ocean liner on the Atlantic. Now, Olympic was absolutely enormous. As I said, she was about 900 feet long, just a smidge under 900 feet. It would take 12 tugboats to help maneuver her in so she could dock and finally arrive at Chelsea Piers. And this is a picture here from the bow of the Olympic looking out onto the sights of Chelsea and Greenwich Village into the heart of New York. Another image of her docked at Chelsea Piers, and you can see all the gangplanks connecting her to the different levels of the pier facilities to allow passengers to disembark and process all of the baggage. Because now we are talking about thousands and thousands of people and ever more thousands and thousands of pieces of baggage. So baggage, I just kind of briefly want to talk about baggage just because it's a bit of an interesting topic. These are a couple of luggage tags from the French line in Cunard, and you can see they note Pier 57, North River. That was the French line's pier at Chelsea Piers. And here you can see Piers 53, 54, and 56 North River for the Cunard line, the pink luggage tag there. And if you see the pink tag, you see the long list of instructions that they had. They would ask passengers to already start forwarding their baggage to the pier several days ahead of the ship sailing, because the sooner it could get there, it could be processed easier. Within the pier facilities were holding rooms for baggage that would be brought over earlier. So many of the wealthy passengers would be staying in some of the best hotels in New York City, and then they could call a service that would take their bags to the pier for them. But they also had to use different labels for the bags that they wanted in their stateroom, because even some of the first class rooms weren't typically enormous unless you were taking passage on one of these so-called royal or imperial suites, which could have two bedrooms, a sitting room, even a bit of a promenade deck. It would have its own private bathroom. It would have a room for the servants, and it would have a room for luggage. So then you could bring in one of your giant steamer trunks and with all your different clothes and dresses and stuff into your room. But even for the majority of first and second class passengers, they had to decide what baggage they wanted with them in their room. So it was like for stateroom, wanted on voyage. And then they would also have a label that said for the hold, and that would be going down below, which they would then not get access to till when the ship landed at the passenger's final destination. Just wanted to share a couple of these funky postcards I found with images of baggage because it had just entered popular culture at the time. But now I mentioned there was an inspection that first and second class passengers had to undergo. Now, New York City, by the early 20th century, it was processing over 50% of the country's foreign trade was coming in and out of New York City. Before 1913, there was not the income tax that we know today in the United States. The majority of federal revenue came from tariffs, from customs duties. And so, of course, in New York City, where you had the most trade and the wealthiest passengers coming through, they would be taxed for what they were bringing back with them from abroad. Is one of the biggest reasons that first class Americans would go abroad was to go shopping. They would spend on the equivalent today of tens of billions of dollars on gloves, stockings, dresses, suits, hats, and jewelry and artwork. And all of that was liable for tax. So you would disembark onto the pier facility, and the pier facility at this point would be overrun with dozens and dozens of customs officials because when the ship entered New York Harbor at about Sandy Hook, a customs official would come aboard, start handing out declaration forms, like sometimes what you have to fill out on a plane when you're landing in a country, you have to fill out that little card. So passengers would fill out, what they're declaring. But then at Chelsea Piers, the custom official had the right to go through everybody's baggage. Some of the more well-to-do passengers could declare like a private area that was a bit screened off. So because you didn't want necessarily your unmentionables being pulled out of your bags and seen by everybody there, because it was raucous and noisy and everybody's bags are getting inspected. And there's plenty of stories of Americans, including some of the wealthiest Americans, trying to avoid paying any tax on their things. So there were stories of false bottoms and trunks. There was one story I read in a magazine from the time. A woman was bringing jewelry back with her from Europe, but she didn't want to pay the tax on it. And she said to her husband, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And he's like, "No, no, we're good American citizens. We'll pay the tax." Say, "Okay, sure, dear, sure." So what she ended up doing was opening up the lining of her husband's jacket and then hiding the jewels within the lining of the jacket, and basically accidentally made her husband an unwitting smuggler. There was another story of a British couple. They had arrived in New York, and she had a $50,000 diamond necklace with her at this point. Now, it was seized by customs officials, but then they accidentally lost it. And this made it into the New York Times that this $50,000 necklace had been lost, but they eventually did recover it. One of the customs officials had just kind of left it in the waiting room accidentally. So it was a busy, chaotic, noisy process. The image on the right, we can see a bunch of workers unloading mail. These ships were floating post offices. As I mentioned, they brought cargo. When the Titanic went down, she took with her art, cars, all sorts of things with her. that would all have been inspected. But now Pier 54 is particularly special because it is linked to two of the greatest tragedies on the Atlantic. So this is Pier 54 on the evening of April 18th, 1912. A huge crowd has gathered outside because they are waiting the arrival of the survivors of Titanic. The Titanic survivors had been rescued by a Cunard ship. Titanic was wife-starred. Carpathia, the ship that rescued them, was of the Cunard line, and Cunard was Pier 54, and that is where Carpathia docked. The Titanic's lifeboats were brought up to Pier 57, 59, which were the White Star Line piers. The strange thing is, this is one of the only known images of the Titanic's lifeboats in New York City. So it's the only piece of the Titanic that actually technically made it to New York City. And the lifeboats were eventually, no one knows 100% sure what happened to them. They were supposedly returned to White Star Line in England and then kind of just disappear from records. But a little piece of Titanic did make it to New York City and docked at Chelsea Piers. But one of the strange ironies about Chelsea Piers is by the time it was finished, it was already basically almost outdated, not necessarily because of all the tech. The most advanced technology and docking facilities were all included, but the ships continued to get bigger. But Chelsea Piers continued to be used here. These are several images of the elevated West Side Highway from the 30s. The Chelsea Piers is continually being used. By 1934, Cunard and White Star Line have merged, and Pier 54, 56 then had the sign that said Cunard White Star on it. And in 1935, a brand new cruise terminal would be opened up between 42nd and 54th Street. And this would allow for the docking of these even larger liners, the Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, the Normandy, all the great glamorous interwar ocean liners. And that's still pretty much the cruise facilities where cruise ships still dock to this day. But after this, Chelsea Piers really entered a long period of decline. And here this is facing out into the water, Cunard White Star. But then by the 60s, this is really what it looked like. It had entered this period of decline. The last ships to use Chelsea Piers were in the late 50s. But also most of the Manhattan waterfront was undergoing a dramatic change. In terms of passenger traffic, it was this great innovation of the jet airliner. Instead of crossing the Atlantic in 5 days, you could now do it in 6, 7 hours. And those were now moving out to the airports out in Queens. For freight traffic, the late 50s saw the birth of the shipping container. And New York, Manhattan's waterfront, nearly all the waterfronts of Queens, Brooklyn, Staten, none of those were really designed for container shipping. So those waterfront facilities were abandoned. Most of container shipping is still today in Port Elizabeth in New Jersey. And this is really what is left of Chelsea Piers, is just this steel iron framework of the entrance of Pier 54. If you stand across the West Side Highway there, you can just make out in the ghost letters of Cunard White Star under the arch there. But that is all that is left today. So it is kind of just a small, silent reminder of this incredible Grand Central terminal that existed on the Hudson River, and one of the most glamorous and fascinating periods in New York City's history. And I'm going to end it there, but I want to try to just share a quick little video that I hope everyone will be able to see. Just move this. It's only about a minute and a half. So from 1922, when Olympic is docking there at Chelsea Piers. So just to kind of see it a little bit in action. All right. So I went a little longer than I had expected, but I am here for questions. So for a lot of the images here, a good chunk of the images are actually from the municipal archives of New York City, that you can find them online and free for yourself. And most of them date from the early decade of Chelsea Piers' existence. So from the 1910s, the three there that I showed with the elevated highway next to it, those are from the 1930s. So we have another question here. Is the Hudson River shallow enough for landfill in the 19th century and deep enough for large ships in the 20th? So what with the water lots, it was up to those folks to actually fill it up. And it was a really fascinating process building these water lots. They would build these artificial bulkheads, pound pillars into the ground, and basically fill it with rubbish. And the Hudson is a little deeper than the East River as well. And it was up to the shipping lines who actually rented the facilities at Chelsea Piers. It was up to them to continually dredge the area there to make sure it remained deep enough, because of course it would get filled up with the Hudson River flowing down from up north. All right, let's see here. What other, okay, we got a good number of comments. Michelangelo, October 1970 to Italy. I bet that was probably from the cruise facility up on in Midtown, because that's where the Italian line was having departures. Let's see what else. And yes, this recording is this presentation was recorded, will be posted onto our YouTube channel. When did the fish estuaries become established? I mean, the waterfront, the Hudson River waterfront was being used through most of the 19th century, and it was already being used by fishing vessels, ferries, ferries going up the Hudson. It was a whole hodgepodge of ships. there was these areas dedicated to the great ocean liners, but the fishing estuaries, I'm not going to say 100% I know, but it was already by the 19th century. If I'm taking a stab at it there, but don't quote me on it. But any other questions here? I highly recommend folks head over there to the west side to about 13th, 14th Street. Take a look at the Pier 54 remains. We've done a couple of walking tours of the west side there to try to uncover the history. As I mentioned, a personal passion of mine. And yes, that little bit is a miracle it survived. I was afraid when they were building that little island that they were gonna take that down with them, but thankfully it's there and preserved. And there's a couple of little tiny markers because since Pier 54, the other great maritime disaster I forgot to mention was the Lusitania, departed from Pier 54 in May 1915 for her final voyage. So it's sometimes been called the cursed pier because both Titanic survivors and the Lusitania, which was then torpedoed by a German U-boat a few days later. Let's see what about more. So I don't know much about the history of the current Chelsea Athletic Complex. I do know it opened in 1995. It was a massive $100 million building project. And of course, it has like ice skating rink and swimming pools and a running track. And I think I read somewhere it's one of the only breweries in Manhattan, or at least when it in the earlier years. One of the early interior images showed stairs. Oh, and a luggage ramp to the left. So yeah, that was like a conveyor belt to help take luggage up to the second level for folks. As I said, this thing was chock block full of fun little gizmos and gadgets. And what's the primary port for shipping in New York currently? So that is Port Elizabeth in New Jersey. So it is still technically the Port of New York. The Port of New York is still like I think the third busiest port in the United States. Most of the big giant behemoth cruise ships which are like 4 times as big as Titanic was, they dock now out in Red Hook and Brooklyn because that facility is the one that can generally manage those giant ships. But cruise ships still dock here in Manhattan, just up there in 45th to 54th Street, that cruise terminal there. And yes, there were survivors of the Titanic at the Jane Hotel. That was actually, it was like the Seamen's Hotel for sailors. It had like this long official name. And that is where the surviving crew of the Titanic stayed while they were in New York City. Oh, and here we got a great comment too, that there's a great promotional film of the Olympics showing life about on board Olympic from, I think it is from the 1920s, and it is available on YouTube. We have another comment. The Coronia was dismantled and put into the interior of one of the Fifth Avenue rest. Oh, that's very cool. That's very cool. That I did not know. I do know in Britain there is a pub or a restaurant somewhere that has some of the interiors of the Olympic. All righty, folks. Well, it is 7 o'clock. So unless there are any more questions, I will bid you all a very good evening. Thank you so much for jumping on here and watching me go on about ocean liners. I absolutely love them. I can't help it. And this is such a, I don't know, it's kind of a neat lost little piece of our amazing city's history. But thank you so much, everyone, and have a great evening. Take care. And I hope to see you at the Art Deco program, which will be hosted by Andrew Berman on July 30th. Take care.